In this presentation, we're going to talk about the porcelain build-up applications. Every time we apply porcelain to a substructure, either that substructure could be a dental alloy metal or ceramic substructures such as pressable like Emax or zirconia, the porcelain has to be condensed. And we talk about the idea of eliminating any moisture from the porcelain before baking the porcelain, because if we don't do this step in the oven, the water is going to create steam, and that steam is going to bubble up, and it's going to have an effect on the bonding between the porcelain and the substructure. We might have bubbles in the porcelain. The porcelain is not going to stick to the substructure, all kind of problems. So this step of extracting excess moisture from the build-up porcelain, it's a very important step. So what are some of the methods? Also, we have to keep in mind that the porcelain shrinks every time we bake porcelain. Um, it kind of, because of the moisture evaporates during the vitrification process or the baking process, and that leads to shrinkage of the porcelain. So the amount of shrinkage is related to the porcelain powder particle size and shape. So therefore, each manufacturer have their own recipe for the porcelain. Some of them, they have a smaller, more finer particle size and shape. Some of them, they're a little bit bigger. So that depends also on the recipe of the porcelain. Porcelain powders contain several sizes of particles to reduce the amount of shrinkage. On the average, the volume shrinkage of the porcelain is between 30 and 40%. In general, the shrinkage of the porcelain during the baking, it's about 14 to 15%. It says here, usually you should be concerned with the linear shrinkage because most of the shrinkage occur overall length. So it's when the shrinkage take place, the porcelain tend to shrink towards where is the most mass, where is the thickest. Okay. Some porcelains are coarse grain, while others are fine grain. Fine grain porcelains has improved handling characteristics and also reduce shrinkage. How a beginner dental technician knows how much the porcelain shrink. Porcelain, it's always shrink towards the greatest bulk, so where is the thickest? That is towards the incisal and interproximal and at the sulpal verge area. So if you think about the height of contour of your crown, that's where the shrinkage take place. Pay careful attention to the line and point angles of the bulk porcelain buildup because they shrink the most, and that's because this is the area where they're outside of that bulkiness and they're thin area. So this is an example of the layering technique, and we're going to present it later on a little more. So what are the methods of condensing porcelain? So we have different methods to extract the moisture out of the build-up porcelain before firing. It's also important to note that there is a good idea to have some moisture in the porcelain during the bake, because we want a little bit of space between the particles of the porcelain during the baking, and that gives us the translucency of the porcelain. But we don't want those big voids where I explained that during the baking, the steam from the moisture trapped in the porcelain, that will create all kinds of problems. So um, never let the porcelain mass dry out during the application. That's a very important step. So when we build up the porcelain, we keep adding, take a small amount and we add, let's say, the full extent of the shape of the tooth. And every time we add, let's say, the mesial aspect, if we move then to build up the distal aspect, the mesial aspect is going to dry out because we're not concentrating on that area anymore, and it's the liquid evaporates in the environment. So always try to keep the porcelain moist during the buildup, and this is kind of like a paradox because we want the moisture out of the crown, the porcelain, before we bake it, but we want to keep it moist during the baking. And the idea of keeping the porcelain moist during the build-up, it's to have the same uniform and constant homogeneous mass of porcelain. If one area of the porcelain is dry out, it's already shrunk. And then the other area, let's say the mesial, it's very dry, and the distal, it's very wet, and we put it in the oven. What's going to happen? The coefficient of shrinkage during the baking, it's going to be at a different rate between those two surfaces. Therefore, the porcelain either is not going to bond or it's going to break. Apply vibration by separating or serrating or tapping with an instrument. This will eliminate large air bubbles or spaces. However, it is hard to control and cracks might unintentionally be created in the buildup. So when we do the vibration with an instrument, that process has to be very delicate. So vibrate it for a short period of time. Use a tissue to extract the moisture from the build-up porcelain and continue if necessary. Don't overdo it. Perform capillary action by blotting from the lingual surface. In this way, the flow of moisture from the facial to the lingual will draw the particle closer together. Perform pressure packing by smoothing with a spatula or pressing with a clean tissue. And continue by wiping or brushing the surface with a large soft brush to fill the surface voids and remove any loose particle. The net effect of these four methods increase the amount of surface tension within the buildup. Surface tension is the actual driving force that tightly binds all the particles of the buildup porcelain together. The entire condensation process can be described as being more molecular than mechanical because it's molecular because when we extract moisture from the porcelain, the distance between the particles of the porcelain decrease because we take out that moisture. So therefore, the porcelain becomes more tight. The particles of the porcelain, they become closer together and the porcelain becomes stronger. So how we prepare for build-up porcelain? First of all, we have to make sure that the cast is clean. If we did any previous work to fit the substructure on the dies, some of the particles from grinding might be stuck to the die or the cast, and that could cross-contaminate the build-up porcelain. So before starting the build-up porcelain, make sure the instruments are clean, your bench is clean, there are no other instruments that you don't need. Just take out just exactly what you need for the build-up, and also make sure both of your casts, the prep cast and the opposing cast, are clean. You can use a steamer to clean up, especially a lot of attention to be paid to how clean the die is. All right. Um, It says here, seal the surface contact areas with a clear fingernail polish or glue to prevent moisture absorption and contamination of the porcelain. That's true, but on the other hand, we gotta think about it this way. If we add nail polish or glue on the contact areas of the adjacent teeth, that's going to interfere with the contact area, how it is in the patient's mouth. So we have to be very, very careful if we decide to do some of those materials, not to layer it in a thick layer. All right, so it should be a very thin layer just to seal the surface of the stone. So the stone, it's not porous, therefore it doesn't absorb moisture when we build up the porcelain. Using a wet brush, adapt a clean piece of tissue or rice paper over the ridge area. And this is when we're talking about building up a pontic. So we're going to describe more in detail why is that important when we build up the pontic based on the design that we want for the pontic. So this is not always area to be concerned. If we have one single crown, we don't need to cover the die with rice paper or tissue paper. Ready materials. Measure out the dentin and enamel porcelains into a glass slab or ceramic dish. Use a nylon or plastic spatula or glass to mix the dentin porcelain with distilled water. And I will say here, not always it's indicated to use distilled water. Use the manufacturer instructions. Many of the newer porcelains, they have modeling or build up liquid. So instead of water, you can use that liquid. The condition of the powder bed is important because the air bubbles might retain in the mixture are a major cause of porcelain failure. So again, when we mix the porcelain with that special liquid, it's very important to make sure that there are no air bubbles traps in the porcelain. So when we apply the porcelain to the substructure, we don't apply extra air, like that, extra moisture that can be trapped in there and create bubbles. Also, very important when we start doing the build-up, use small amounts of porcelain. So never take out on a brush a large amount of porcelain because it's very hard to handle it. So small amounts added on the substructure where it's needed, and use the brush or the spatula to shape it up the way we want it, and also make sure that it's layered properly and consistently. Okay, it has the same thickness. We can use color modifiers in the build-up, but again, when we use internal stains, we have to be careful because those are very, very intense colors. And if we put too much color, that can take out so easily. So we have to strip the porcelain and start all over again. So layering technique, there are many different methods of porcelain application. And each has a different approach to mimic the natural shape of teeth. Um, some people believe that there should be some kind of optical differences between different layers of the porcelain. So from, dentin to enamel, we should have a little bit of gradation, right? So if we look at the natural teeth, starting from the gum line towards the incisal or the occlusal, we see that towards the gum line, the tooth is a little more opacious and the shade is a little bit darker. And then the more we go up, the colors change it, become more, I wouldn't say light, but more translucent. Okay. So this is what we're trying to achieve. Applying cervical porcelain, and this is the porcelain that it's applied by the gum line. And this the porcelain. It's again mix it with the liquid, following the manufacturer instructions, and start at the cervical or the gum line and flow it into the substructure. It says here into the opaque, but think about it, for ceramic substructure, we don't have opaque, right? So place each instrument or each increment of porcelain with a gentle pushing and tapping action and absorb the excess water with a clean, dry tissue. Less cervical porcelain is used to simulate youth, more it's used for middle ages or elderly dentition. The cervical porcelain, it's more an opacious porcelain, so it's more dull porcelain. So we want, if the patient is a younger patient, we want to use less of this porcelain because it gives that dullness of the tooth. So how we apply opacious dentin? This material was developed with a greater opacity for use in special shading situations. So this is not something that we use for every case. Opacious dentin is an intermediate shade porcelain falling between the cervical and dentin shade porcelain. Use opacious dentin in place of cervical porcelain around the neck of teeth to show light presentation of the opaque layer. In the darkened and shadow interdental area, use it to create color and brightness. Opacious dentin is especially helpful in correcting the shade differences between the pontic gingival portion and that of the retainers. This difference is due to the absence of opaque porcelain on the pontic internal surface and the dark reflection of the gingiva. Also, the opacious dentin to create effects in very thin area to prevent opacious show-through. So in other words, opacious dentin has multiple applications, but these are not indicated for every case. This is indicated for the cases where the pontic shows more translucency and we want to copy the dullness of the cervical area of the adjacent teeth. And also it can be used on the, instead of cervical porcelain, to kind of create that depth of the porcelain when we build up. Applying dental porcelain. Build the dental porcelain drop by drop using a brush or apply a greater amount of material using a spatula. Do not let the porcelain dry out, leaving large voids in the buildup. Gentle vibration of the cast will bring water to the surface where it can be blotted away. Avoid heavy vibration because it tends to make the porcelain slump. It may also displace internal color or stains if we put it in there. Color control slumping by pressing with a tissue on the lingual surface to draw the moisture through the porcelain. As water is drawn, the particles pack closer together to the surface tension. Slightly overbeard the porcelain because we said that the porcelain is going to shrink during the baking process. And at this point, the porcelain should be compact and moist. A brush additive technique is suitable when placing porcelain modifiers and stain in the buildup as it progresses. So in other words, if we need to add internal stains, don't use a spatula to add those stains because spatula tend to add more material. It's not so thin, like we can have a very thin build-up brush. On the other hand, the spatula technique is quicker and molding the porcelain build-up, it's easier. So if we need to build up, for instance, a bridge, we can use a spatula to help us apply the build-up porcelain. Cutback. Note that not only does the cutback create space for the enamel porcelain, but it also forms the shape of the natural dentin with the dentin porcelain. The amount of dentin porcelain remaining depending on the shade selected and the firing shrinkage of the porcelain mass. There is also a relationship between the amount of dentin, enamel, and age. Young teeth have larger pulp jumpers and more dentin, less enamel than the middle-aged teeth. The older the patient, the thicker the enamel layer becomes. Using a bladed instrument, cut back the incisal third of the proximal surfaces. Make 2 small grooves in the labial surface to simulate mamelons and check the thickness of the dentin porcelain covering the opaque with an instrument. So this is in pictures the layering technique for the porcelain applications. So if we look at the first picture, we see that this is a presentation for how we apply the build-up porcelain over the opaque porcelain that was already applied on the coping. Small brush and also a small amount of porcelain. When we apply different types of porcelain, dentin and incisal, always make sure we blend that in. So both of the materials, they kind of blend in and they don't have like a line demarcation between them. If we look at the natural teeth, there is no like a line where, you know, half of the tooth it's dull and half of the tooth it's transparent or translucent, okay? So everything gets more gradual, going from more opacious towards more translucent. So this is what we're trying to achieve. All right. Always make sure you add small amounts of porcelain and also use the condensation. The cut back technique, you can use a spatula to cut back some of the porcelain that we build up. And again, with the spatula, we have more control how much material we can cut back. Also, don't forget, every time we build up porcelain, especially on bridges, right? If we start building up on one side and we move now, let's say from right to left, right? We finish, build up the left side, now we're moving towards the right side. The left side is going to get dry. So from time to time, make sure to keep that porcelain moist. Applying the enamel porcelain. Mix the enamel porcelain or the incisal porcelain a little thinner than the dentin porcelain. If the build-up porcelain, so the the one that we already put in, it's a little bit dry, before we apply the enamel or the incisal porcelain, make sure that the porcelain that we already apply, it's a little bit moist. Try to add wet porcelain to already dry porcelain will cause entrapment of large air bubbles, an area of blotchy opacity. So it's going to look funny. It's not going to look natural. So pick up a little bit of enamel porcelain and apply it to the buildup. Continue to build up the incisal area until the original contour or the shape of the tooth is established. The final buildup should extend 1 to 1.5 millimeter past the desired length. Again, we have to be careful because the porcelain shrinks. The enamel porcelain should blend very well into the middle third, or for some shades, into the gingival third of the tooth. This enamel overlay prevents a visible line of demarcation that creates an illusion of depth. Completion. Using a thin blade, remove any more porcelain from below the proximal contact area that may be an undercut. Carefully remove the build-up restoration from the cast. So this procedure explains how to remove the crown with the build-up porcelain from the die and have it ready for the baking process. Carefully remove the build-up restoration from the cast. Remove any dirt particle that may be present because they will be visible through the porcelain. I will say inspect first to see if there are any particles that they shouldn't be there. But if you take the measures before you start using the porcelain to have everything nice and clean and disinfected, you shouldn't have to do this step. Moisten the mesial and distant contact area of the buildup and apply clear porcelain to this area. This is for the cases where the clear porcelain is needed, for instance, for area where the tooth is wider, it looks wider than the tooth that we need to copy. So it's not always indicated to use. It's, like opacious dentin. Okay. Smooth the completely built up with a large soft brush to remove any loose particles. Clean excess porcelain away from the metal ceramic junction as well as porcelain particles inside the crown. This is very important because once we finish build up the crown and we remove it from the die, right, we're ready to put it in the oven. Now, sometimes little particles of the porcelain may get trapped inside the coping. And if we bake it like this, then the porcelain is going to bond with the substructure. Therefore, when we try to fit the crown back into the die, it's not going to fit. So before baking the porcelain, take a clean brush and clean up the inside of the coping. Make sure there is no porcelain inside there. Check the overall outline, contour in detail of the build-up. Place the restoration to be fired on a firing tray. So how we build up porcelain cusps? There are two ways of controlling firing shrinkage. Either porcelain can be built in 2 or 3 bakes to full occlusal with the articulator close, or the porcelain can be done in 1 bake with the incisal pin open 1 to 2 millimeters. Using the later method, occlusion is restored when refined during the contouring step. So in other words, this procedure tells us that when we build up the porcelain, because we know the porcelain is going to shrink, we can open up the pin 1 to 2 millimeters to allow us to build up to overbuild the incisal or the occlusal surfaces, because the porcelain is going to shrink during the baking. And if there are any areas that are high after we bake, we can put the crown back into the die, into the model on the articulating, and using articulating paper, we can adjust the areas where it's necessary, grind the porcelain, okay? Apply the enamel porcelain to the buildup in wax-added fashion. So again, small increments of porcelain. Make sure it's blended well with the rest of the porcelain, okay? And then first the functioning cusp and then the non-functioning cusp. So this is what we try to build up first. Apply enamel porcelain to the external surface of the buildup before establishing the internal inclinations of the cast. So in other words, build up the length, right? The main shape of the cusp. And then we're going to concentrate on building up the triangular ridges, the inclined planes, and all the other features that may need to be copied. Next, add the marginal ridges and fill the remaining occlusal voids. Condense the porcelain buildup at each stage. The completed enamel buildup should elevate the incisal pin by 1 millimeter to compensate for the shrinkage. After building with the restoration in occlusion, carve the primary grooves in the occlusal surface with a brush tip. That's a very routine and good technique. When we build up the porcelain and we want to put the primary and the secondary grooves, we can use a very thin brush with very good tip to create those grooves. So use the brush to kind of take out the excess porcelain in the areas where we want the grooves to be. Remove the buildup and add to the proximal contacts. So thoroughly condense the buildup porcelain. Always when we take out the crown from the die, right, the porcelain on the contact area, it's going to be a little bit rough. So this is what this presentation, this sentence talk about. Make sure that the area of the contact is smooth. If we need, you can add a tiny bit of porcelain just to compensate for that shrinkage. But the main idea is to condensate and make sure that the porcelain is smooth in the contact area before baking. Because the firing shrinkage can be predicated fairly accurately, carve the delicate secondary anatomy into the occlusal surfaces using a small bladed instrument. So we can use an instrument like the tip of the spatula, or like I said, a very thin brush with a good pointy tip. Modified layering technique. The clinical crown of a natural tooth is covered with enamel, creating a transition and depth of the natural color. The conventional layering technique does not provide this wraparound effect of enamel. Use the modified layering technique as shown in as follows. Cut back the incisal third, proximal, and the interproximal surfaces of the dental layer. Remove about 1 millimeter of the porcelain from each surface. Be sure to draw accurate guidelines on the surface before cutting back. The amount of cutback on the proximal and interproximal surfaces is especially difficult to determine because we cannot measure it. Apply enamel porcelain to the dental layer. The enamel layer should be built up to resemble the contour of the dental porcelain prior to cutback. So in other words, this modified layering technique talks about building up the tooth shape first with dentin layer of porcelain, right? So we have dentin porcelain, and we're going to build it up to the full extent of the shape of the tooth that we need to copy. And then we can use the cutback technique. So we're going to cut back some of that porcelain, the dentin porcelain, and apply the incisor porcelain to fill up again the full contour shape that we want. Okay. The completely built up should be 15 to 20% larger than the finished restoration because of the shrinkage, right? Once the facial surface is complete, cut back the lingual surface to make room for the next porcelain addition. Apply clear porcelain to the prepared lingual surface to complete the wraparound effect. Completion of the build-up is the same as the basic layering technique. So this is what we're trying to achieve with the wraparound effect of enamel, where if you look at the natural tooth, the blue surface, that represents the enamel or the incisal structure of the tooth. When we do the wraparound build-up of the enamel or incisal porcelain, we kind of follow the same procedure. So the blue area of the wraparound picture kind of follow the same guideline and the same shape as the natural incisal structure of the tooth. Okay. Porcelain margin technique. The ideal preparation for colorless, so no color, crown. It's a 90-degree shoulder preparation on the facial extending from one proximal surface to the other. This type of labial margin preparation allows you to butt the porcelain directly into the shoulder area. So in other words, we use this porcelain to create that margin. And again, we have to look how the margin it's prepared, and we don't want any undercut in that area. So materials, in addition to conventional materials, you will need cyanide glue, cyanide acrylate glue for sealing the surface of a die, porcelain separating medium or mineral oil to use as a release agent for the raw porcelain, shoulder porcelain for building the porcelain margin, and we talked about this in a previous lecture. Medium for mixing the shoulder porcelain. It says here distilled water, but again, based on the manufacturer instruction and based on the newest porcelain that we have, there are built-up liquids that we can use. Special prepared waxes also have been developed to mix with the porcelain. Yes, there is true that there are special waxes that we can mix with the porcelain, and the idea is that we mix the porcelain instead of the liquid, we mix with melted wax, and when we bake the porcelain, the wax melts, and therefore the baking takes place. It's, so to speak, we have more control over the baking process. It's a technique that it's usually mostly used for repairs, not for a lot of build-up, because it's time-consuming. It's a time-consuming process. So it says here, mix 8 parts porcelain to 1 part wax by weight. It's a special wax, so it's not any kind of wax that we use for fabricating the wax pattern. It works very well, like I said, when we do small areas, like if we do repairs, like it says here for margins, that small area, but to do the whole build up, it's kind of like very difficult because it's time consuming, and it's hard to manage. You have two materials that have different temperatures, right? So wax has to be a little bit soft and melted to be applied, and porcelain, when it's cold, at the room temperature, it's cold. So um, there are some pro and con for this technique, but like I said, this technique works very well for small areas. So it's very difficult to achieve marginal accuracy when it comes to especially margins, due to the fact that the porcelain shrinks during the baking. What we need to mention here also, that the margin porcelain or the shoulder porcelain that we have today on the market, um, the shrinkage, its ratio, it's a little bit better. So it doesn't shrink as much as, let's say, the dentin or incisor. So we presented this before, how we build up, uh, when we have a butt margin, right? So the coping, it's cut a little bit short from the margin, leaving a little space for applying shoulder porcelain. All right. When we apply the shoulder porcelain again, the first firing with the shoulder porcelain, um, it's going to shrink a little more, and then maybe we need to do the second firing, add the second layer of shoulder porcelain. Alter shades, dentin effect. Basic hue and chroma changes can be made to a small area of the dentin porcelain or to the entire facial surface area of a veneer. To increase chroma in a small area, start by building up the porcelain to a full contour, then carve away the porcelain in the affected area. Next, apply the effect powder to that area, tapering the porcelain into the sides. It's good to mention that different manufacturers, they have porcelains for different effects. All right, so to give you an example, Ivoclar, Vivident, the one that we use for build up the Emax build up porcelain, they have different special porcelains that have different opaque. So they have like mother of pearl opaque effect. So before using those special porcelains, um, first find out if you need it, and first find out how you can use it properly, and the ratio, how much you can use to create that effect, because those porcelains are very intense. Okay. Next, apply the effect powder to the area, tapering the porcelain into the sides. The dentist might request that the entire gingival shade be altered, changing the hue of the veneer. To make a predominant gray shade appear yellower or more yellow, first cover the opaque with a layer of porcelain that has yellow hue. Follow this layer with a layer of porcelain that has a gray hue. You can decipher the dominant hue for a given shade porcelain by looking at the shade guide. And that's true. Always the shade guide is going to show you what porcelain you can add. So for instance, in a tooth, we can have different shades. We're looking at, let's say, one surface of the tooth. Let's take a central, right? We may have a A2, A3 by the gum line. We may have maybe A1 by the middle of the tooth, and maybe we may have a B1 by the incisal. So now we're working with three shades. So how we control the porcelain and what porcelain effects we can add to create that that shade a patient has. However, the desired effect you can make by combining different porcelain shades, and this is the most used technique. It's not so much using those porcelain effects, but mostly it's by using different shades of the porcelain. Dentin mamelons. In many cases, dentin mamelons originate during the development of teeth, appearing as three-finger-like extension of the dentin, separating the incisal edges. To simulate this effect, the porcelain is built to full contour, and two grooves are cut into the incisal third. Then a small amount of colorless porcelain is placed in each groove, and the net effect will be to increase the translucency in that area. So again, dentin effects in dental porcelain, discolor fillings are a composite or plastic restorative material that have stained or have been discolored. They usually appear opaque like and have brown discoloration or darker discoloration on their surface, especially on the marginal surfaces. Build up the porcelain to full contour and hollow up the area to be filled. Lightly coat the walls of the cavity with yellow-brown stain, and then fill the cavity with the core opaque porcelain, followed by clear porcelain. Right? So again, how we can induce different effects on the porcelain by using different type of dentin and also cutback techniques to create those effects of mamelons. We can also create crack lines. The crack lines, you can see those mostly in older patients, and there's nothing wrong with the tooth. It's just that the groove on the surface of the tooth, it's a little bit darker, and the junction between the lobes of the tooth, it's darker. So we just need to copy that. We can add stain to create that cracked porcelain, but also we can add create this illusion using the cutback method into the porcelain before baking. So we can cut a V-shaped wedge into the incisor third, and then we can apply the stain inside the porcelain before baking. And this is called internal staining. I'm not a proponent of internal staining per se, because it's, like I said, stains are very intense, and if we trying to achieve a more natural look and we add too much stain, then the only way to correct that is to grind back where we apply the stain or strip the porcelain and start all over again. So very careful if we use the technique of internal staining. Also, we can use different type of porcelains or stains to modify the illusion of a tooth being wider or narrower. Okay, so we can use clear or translucent porcelain on the line angles to create the illusion that the tooth is a little bit wider or narrower. Or for the same idea, we can use a blue shade on the line angle to create the same effect. Hypocalcification, those are again something that we don't see in every patient. So those are the white stains that we see in some patients, especially younger patients. And there's nothing wrong with the tooth. You know, the tooth is strong and healthy. But there are some natural stains of the tooth. Again, special attention when the stain is applied, because white stain, it's very intense, and usually it pops up very, very much. If, let's say, the patient has like a darker color, natural darker color of his teeth, and then, you know, the hypocalcification are a little bit dull, they're not very intense, then maybe when we apply the white stain, we have to apply again smaller amounts and make sure it's not very concentrated so it doesn't create that intense effect. Blue translucency. So natural teeth, they have this translucency, especially on the incisal edge and also on the mesial and distal. We can use for this a small amount of incisal porcelain that we can carry over towards the proximal surfaces, or we can use, like I said, the blue stains that they have this effect to create the translucency. Incisal orange hue. Uh, Notice how this effect appear as an orange hue at the incisal, but short of the incisal edge. So it's towards the incisal, but it's not quite at the edge. The enamel outlines the orange effect as a hollow. To reproduce this effect, first scoop out a section of the enamel porcelain from the facial surface of the incisal edge. Next, apply orange stain to the prepared area and follow that with an application of clear porcelain. So, incisal effects. Um, if we use the technique of build up dentin and enamel in the same build up and bake it in the same time. After we add all the porcelains, the dentin first and then the incisal, and then we condensate it, we take out the excess moisture, then we have to let the um, porcelain dry out before starting the baking program. So this procedure ensure that any moisture that is in the porcelain, it's eliminated before baking, so there is no steam during the baking process. The amount of drying time depends on the amount of moisture, which can be judged by the density of the mass and elapsed time from the initial application. So if I start building up a crown 15 minutes ago, you know, the crown starts to dry out already, the porcelain. Also, setting the entrance temperature too high will fracture the porcelain, because that's going to create a shock to the porcelain. So make sure that the porcelain is set up at the proper temperature as the manufacturer intended. If we increase that temperature, the initial temperature, it creates a shock into the porcelain, and then, you know, the bonding and also um, the the bubbling of the porcelain of the surface of the substructure will increase. Therefore, it's going to be misfiring. Dry and preheat gradually by moving the restoration closer to the hot zone in the furnace. The entire drying, preheating, and inserting process usually takes about 3 to 6 minutes, depending on the number of units to be fired. the entrance temperature should stay at about 600 degrees Celsius during this entire process. And again, the 600 degree number, it's subject to change based on the manufacturer instructions for baking temperature. Firing sequence, center the restoration in a muffle or in the firing platform and close the muffle door. Seal the vacuum chamber and start the vacuum pump. All these instructions that you see here in this paragraph, there are instructions where you have to enter each stage of the program by hand each time. So once the ovens that we have today, they're more sophisticated, and we can enter all the parameter of each firing stage in each program. So, or some of the programs are already built up if we buy the porcelain system from manufacturers. They usually put the programs in their ovens for their porcelains. Okay, so we just have to match what type of porcelain we're using and what stage, first bake, second bake, um, stain and glaze, with what stage we're baking at. Okay. Um, Again, in terms of the temperatures, we have to make sure that we understand the maturity point of the porcelain based on what the manufacturer tells us. Okay, some porcelains are high fuse porcelains, therefore they're maturing at a higher temperature when they bake. Some porcelain are medium or low fuse, therefore they're maturing at a lower temperature. So make sure you understand and follow the manufacturer instructions before using any porcelain system. So that concludes our presentation. Thank you.